On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the glass doors of Crestview Bank slid open, and in stepped a figure that immediately drew the attention of everyone in the lobby. Robert Jenkins, an elderly black man with weathered hands and silver curls matted beneath an old knit cap, walked slowly toward the center of the room. His coat was tattered, patched with years of wear, and his shoes barely held together. Slung over his shoulder was a faded canvas bag that looked heavy. With more than just its physical contents, it seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. Conversations died down as curious glances turned to mocking whispers. The contrast between Robert's humble appearance and the marble-tiled prestige of Crestview Bank could not have been more stark, with the quiet determination of a man who had waited far too long for this moment. Robert paused in front of the main counter. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting those of the startled and scornful patrons and staff. Then, in a soft but unmistakably firm voice, he declared, "This bank is mine." The silence that followed his statement lasted just a second before erupting into a wave of laughter. Some customers scoffed audibly, others chuckled behind hands, and a pair of tellers exchanged glances and shook their heads as if they had just witnessed the punchline to an absurd joke. The mood shifted from mild curiosity to outright ridicule, with several people openly questioning whether the man had wandered in from the street by mistake. Brandon Scott, the bank's head of security, and a man known for his short temper and rigid approach to order, quickly stepped forward. His broad frame cast a shadow over Robert as he walked with purpose, already preparing to escort the old man out. "All right," Sir Brandon said in a condescending tone, one hand resting near his belt. "You've made your statement. Let's not make a scene." His eyes were narrowed, his stance tense. This was not a man interested in understanding, only enforcing the rules. To him, Robert was just another troublemaker, another inconvenience that didn't belong in the pristine space of Crestview Bank. But Robert didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice, nor did he step back. Instead, he turned slowly to face Brandon and the growing crowd, his expression steady, his posture straightening despite the obvious strain in his joints. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice carrying further than anyone expected. "I'm here to take back what's mine, what was stolen from me more than 50 years ago." The bank, which had been filled with laughter just moments before, grew still. A few people furrowed their brows, caught off guard by the gravity in his voice. Others exchanged glances, unsure whether to be amused, concerned, or dismissive. The change in the atmosphere was subtle but undeniable. What began as a spectacle of ridicule had become something else, something harder to brush aside. Brandon hesitated for a moment, perhaps surprised that Robert hadn't cowered or backed down. Behind the counters, employees paused mid-transaction, and several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For reasons they couldn't explain, some began to feel that this man's presence wasn't a joke at all. There was a quiet power in Robert's voice, a conviction that suggested his words weren't born of delusion, but from truth. Truth, long buried now, clawing its way to the surface. Robert glanced around once more, locking eyes with people who moments ago had dismissed him as nothing more than a vagrant. He didn't plead for attention or ask for sympathy. Instead, he stood rooted in place, as if the very floor beneath him was laid by his own hands. There was dignity in the way he held himself. Worn by time, yes, but not broken. His canvas bag swayed slightly as he shifted his weight, a silent reminder that he had come prepared. And though no one in the room knew it yet, what was inside that bag would soon unravel everything they thought they knew about Crestview Bank. As the mocking laughter faded into an uneasy silence, Robert Jenkins slowly knelt down and set his worn canvas sack gently on the marble floor of Crestview Bank. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. Every eye in the lobby was fixed on him, some with disbelief, others with growing curiosity. Carefully, he untied the frayed strings that had held the bag closed for decades. The air seemed to grow heavier as he pulled out several old yellow documents wrapped in a protective cloth, each page fragile with age yet powerful in its significance. One by one, Robert laid the contents on the bank's central counter. Faded ledgers, notarized agreements, and a leather-bound founding charter dated 1948, each one bearing his full name, Robert L. Jenkins. Whispers rippled through the room. At first, people leaned in out of skepticism, but as they began to process what was in front of them, that skepticism gave way to astonishment. Daniel Reed, the bank's branch manager, and a man known for his cool professionalism, stepped forward to see for himself. Earlier, he had dismissed Robert as a confused old man, perhaps suffering from delusions or senility. But now, as he flipped through the brittle pages of the founding ledger, his demeanor changed. There it was clear as daylight. Robert's signature dated nearly 8 decades ago next to entries that documented initial capital contributions, board appointments, and bank charter approvals. The name Crestview Bank was etched at the top alongside Robert's handwriting, all predating any record tied to the bank's current owners. Daniel's hands began to tremble as he turned the pages, his eyes scanning every word, every faded stamp. The color drained from his face. This wasn't just an old man's fantasy, this was evidence overwhelming and undeniable. Around him, tellers and customers leaned in closer, their expressions shifting from amused detachment to stunned recognition. Robert stood silently for a moment, allowing the weight of his documents to speak for themselves. Then, in a voice steady and raw with emotion, he began to speak not as a victim, but as a man reclaiming what had been violently taken from him. He told them of a time when he had worked day and night to build something for his community, a bank that would serve everyone regardless of color or class. Crestview Bank had once been a dream born from struggle, sweat and vision. But in 1951, just 3 years after opening its doors, Robert's trusted business partner, William Harlan, had betrayed him. With the help of other influential white businessmen in the city, William had used fabricated documents and backroom dealings to remove Robert from the board. They claimed he had signed over his shares, declared him unfit to manage finances, and slowly erased his name from all official records. Robert's protests were dismissed by every institution he turned to for help. Courts wouldn't listen. Lawyers turned him away, and the bank his bank carried on as if he had never existed. As Robert spoke, the room grew quieter still. His voice didn't waver. He recounted how he had preserved every document, safeguarded every letter, and carried the truth with him for more than 50 years. "I knew one day," he said, "the world would have to look me in the eye again, and when it did, I'd have the truth in my hands." Daniel Reed was speechless, still staring at the documents, as if trying to make sense of a history he'd been trained to never question. He had grown up believing the legacy of Crestview Bank belonged solely to the Harlan family, but now in front of him stood the real founder, a man they had buried beneath decades of silence and systemic prejudice. Robert's tale wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a piercing indictment of an era that had denied so many like him their rightful place in history. And yet, even after all that time, he hadn't come seeking vengeance. He came seeking truth, dignity, and restoration. His legacy had been stolen, but not erased. Now, with the documents exposed and the truth laid bare for all to see, the question no longer was whether they believed him. The question was, what were they going to do about it? The silence that followed Robert's story was thick with disbelief and awakening, but Robert wasn't done. With quiet determination, he reached back into his sack and retrieved a second bundle. This one secured with a red ribbon that had faded to rust brown over time. He slowly untied it, revealing legal affidavits correspondence between attorneys and a sworn declaration from a notary who had long since passed away. These documents were different. They weren't just historical. They were legal evidence, unambiguous proof that Robert Jenkins had never signed away his shares in Crestview Bank. In fact, a notarized document from 1951 explicitly stated that no such transaction had ever occurred. This was the smoking gun the Harlan family had forged Robert's signature fabricated paperwork and used that fraud to seize control of the very institution he had founded. Robert laid the documents out methodically, allowing those around him to read them for themselves. The bank's employees, once smug, dismissive, and even cruel, now looked at him with wide, unblinking eyes. There was no longer any doubt. The man standing in front of them had not only told the truth, he had backed it up with evidence that could hold up in court. At that moment, a shift occurred in the atmosphere, subtle but powerful. The whispers turned into murmurs of shame, of recognition, of quiet support. It was no longer about the old man who claimed he owned the bank. It was about a man who had survived betrayal, institutional racism, and silence, only to return with grace and justice in hand. Among the crowd, a young teller named Melissa Carter stepped out from behind the counter. She was new to the branch, still in her early 20s, and unlike the others, she hadn't laughed when Robert first entered. With careful steps and a steady voice, she approached the table and looked at the documents. Then she looked at Robert, and with a nod of deep respect, she said, "Mr. Jenkins, I believe you, and I'm sorry for what they took from you." Her words rang out louder than any announcement. It wasn't just her apology, it was her acknowledgement of the truth of history of humanity. Inspired by Melissa's courage, others began to move forward. Some customers, older folks who had banked with Crestview for decades, dug into their wallets and purses. They pulled out old $5 and $10 bills. Some yellowed and worn, each bearing the original Crestview seal from before the Harlan rebranding. One by one, they laid those bills on the counter, silently honoring Robert's legacy. It was a quiet but profound act of solidarity, an offering, a gesture of conscience. One elderly man whispered, "My father told me about a man who started this bank. I think it was you." Soon the entire bank lobby had transformed. What had begun as an act of mockery became a moment of revelation. And as people crowded around the table, studying the evidence, listening to the story, a collective reckoning unfolded. The employees who had ridiculed Robert looked down, ashamed. Even Brandon Scott, the security chief, who had nearly thrown Robert out, now stood by the door silent and still. The bank, this proud, polished institution, was no longer a place of denial. It had become a courtroom of truth, and the verdict was undeniable. For Robert, it wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about having his name restored, his dignity acknowledged, and his contribution recognized after a lifetime of being erased. He hadn't just come to reclaim a title, he had come to reclaim the narrative. And now, with the truth finally breaking through, he saw it written across their faces: remorse, respect, and something even deeper, a collective conscience awakening from a long sleep. This wasn't just Robert's moment. It was everyone's. And for the first time in decades, the bank finally felt like it belonged to its true founder again. As the tension in the lobby reached its peak, the silence was shattered by the sharp, deliberate click of a weapon being unholstered. Brandon Scott, the head of security, who had mocked Robert from the start, now stood rigid with fury. His hand, gripping a firearm, pointed toward the floor, but ready. His face, once confident and dismissive, was now contorted with confusion and resistance. To him, this wasn't just about documents or old history. It was about preserving the status quo, about not letting everything he believed be dismantled by a man society had taught him to overlook. "This is nonsense," Brandon barked. "You don't get to walk in here and rewrite history." But before he could take another step, a firm voice cut through the growing chaos. Daniel Reed, the bank manager, who had earlier dismissed Robert with a smirk, stepped forward this time, not as a bystander, but as a man changed. He placed himself directly between Brandon and Robert, lifting a hand to signal the security officer to stop. "That's enough," Daniel said, his voice low, but unwavering. "Put it away." His eyes never left Brandon's as he continued. "You've read the same documents I have. You've seen the signatures. You've seen the dates. We both know they're real." There was no more room for doubt. And with that, Daniel turned to face the crowd and did what few expected. He admitted the truth out loud. This bank was founded by Robert Jenkins. What was stolen from him is undeniable. And if siding with justice means standing against the Harlan family, then so be it. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room. For decades, the Harlan family had been untouchable, wealthy, powerful and interwoven with Crestview Bank's identity. But Daniel, in this moment of reckoning, chose principle over power. His declaration was more than just words. It was a moral stand, one that placed his career, his reputation, and perhaps even his safety at risk. But Daniel no longer wanted to be complicit. The weight of what had been exposed was too great. He turned back to Robert and gave a small solemn nod, a gesture of respect and a silent apology. Brandon, still holding the weapon, felt the world tilt beneath him. He looked around the room, scanning the faces of his colleagues, once jeering, now reverent, and the customers who now regarded Robert as more than just a man in ragged clothes. His grip loosened slightly, and his eyes met Robert's, not with defiance, but with something closer to confusion, maybe even shame. Everything he had been taught, every bias he had absorbed, was now unraveling in front of him. And Robert hadn't screamed, hadn't fought, hadn't demanded vengeance. He had stood there with grace, with truth in hand, and watched as justice began to bloom from the cracks in the institution. Brandon's hand trembled. He looked to Daniel one last time, searching for permission, or perhaps guidance. Daniel gave a simple nod. That was all it took. Brandon slowly lowered the weapon, the tension breaking like a storm releasing rain. The sound of it sliding back into its holster was almost louder than the click that had started it all. He stepped back, his eyes still on Robert. Didn't know, he said under his breath. And Robert, without anger, simply replied, "Now you do." The moment passed like a long exhale. What could have ended in violence had instead become a defining act of conscience. A tense showdown gave way to moral clarity, and in that clarity the truth was no longer something to fear, but something to uphold. Everyone in the room had witnessed it the moment power bent its knee to justice, and a man long forgotten was finally rightfully seen. Robert Jenkins stepped out of the glass doors of Crestview Bank with the same slow, deliberate pace that he had entered, but everything had changed. The man who had been laughed at just hours earlier now walked through the lobby as a figure of dignity and reverence. No applause followed him. No grand announcement declared his victory. Instead, the silence itself spoke volumes. Employees who had once ridiculed him lowered their eyes in humility or offered quiet nods of acknowledgement. Customers who had once scoffed at his tattered coat and wrinkled hands now shifted in discomfort, offering gentle gestures of respect, some even stepping aside as he passed, as if giving way to something greater than a man. He didn't smile, didn't wave. He simply carried himself with the calm dignity of someone who had long known the truth and had finally made the world see it too. Inside, Daniel Reed stood alone at the center of the bank floor, watching Robert's back as it disappeared through the door. He knew that moment would define the rest of his career. The easy path would be silence, to let the event be swept away in the folds of bureaucracy and memory, but Daniel had made his choice. With a deep breath, he turned toward his office, not to hide but to act. He drafted a formal petition to present Robert's documents to the board of directors, requesting that Crestview Bank officially acknowledge Robert Jenkins as its rightful founder. Daniel knew it wouldn't be easy. The Harlan family still held influence, but the time for quiet complicity had passed. What had begun as a confrontation had now become a call to justice, and Daniel, for the first time, felt proud of the weight he was about to carry. The news spread quickly. By the end of the week, local headlines read, "Forgotten Founder, Returns, Crestview, Faces, Historic Reckoning." Reporters sought interviews, but Robert declined them all. He wasn't seeking attention. He was seeking restoration. Across the town, older residents began digging through boxes in their attics, searching for old banknotes, letters, or articles that mentioned Robert's early work. Stories emerged from unexpected corners: retired teachers, former clerks, even a janitor, each with a fragment of a memory that confirmed what Robert had always claimed. Churches, barbershops, and cafes buzzed with conversation, not just about the bank, but about how easily a man's legacy had been erased simply because of the color of his skin. The reckoning wasn't just legal. It was moral. It was cultural. In a quiet neighborhood on the town's edge, Robert returned to the small home he had lived in for over 40 years. There were no medals or certificates waiting on his doorstep, but what awaited him was something deeper peace. He placed the old canvas sack of documents on his kitchen table, unfolded one of the ledgers, and ran a finger over his name in faded ink. For decades, that name had meant nothing to those in power. But now it was being spoken again in boardrooms, classrooms, and dinner tables across the county. He thought of his late wife, who had urged him never to let go of the truth. He thought of the many nights he had sat alone, wondering if it was even worth trying. And now, at last, he had his answer. Months later, a plaque was installed at the entrance of Crestview Bank. It bore Robert Jenkins' name and the words, "Original Founder, Visionary Survivor, Truth Teller." School children were brought on field trips to learn the story of the man who had been forgotten, then remembered. The bank hosted its first diversity and justice seminar, where Daniel gave a talk titled "The Cost of Silence." Melissa Carter, the young employee who had first acknowledged Robert, led a mentorship program aimed at uplifting overlooked voices in the community. The institution began to change not through grand gestures, but through the slow, intentional work of honoring what had been lost. Robert's story became more than just a tale of corporate betrayal and redemption. It became a parable of patience, proof that truth may be delayed but never destroyed. In a world often obsessed with moving fast and forgetting easily, his walk into the bank that day reminded everyone that history doesn't just belong to the powerful, it belongs to the persistent. And as the seasons turned and the plaque caught morning sunlight through the lobby windows, one thing became certain. While Robert Jenkins had entered the bank alone, he left behind a legacy that would never be silenced again. If this story moved, you don't forget to subscribe to Deep Inside HQ for more powerful narratives that uncover hidden truths and honor voices that were once silenced. Each story we share is a tribute to resilience, justice, and the human spirit, and your support helps us bring these stories to light. Share this video with someone who believes in second chances and the power of truth, and join the conversation in the comments below. Let's keep shining a light on the stories that matter most.